The storm outside was still raging when Richard Hale, one of the city's most well-known millionaires, leaned back in the leather seat of his brand new car. The rain pelted the windshield, city lights shimmered on wet streets, and the world outside felt as restless as his heart inside. At 62, Richard had everything most people dream of: towering offices in downtown, sprawling mansions along the coast, and more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Yet, for all his wealth, what he longed for wasn't another deal or another luxury. It was trust, real, genuine trust, something money couldn't buy. That's why tonight, as the thunder rumbled overhead, Richard placed a small brown envelope on the back seat of his car. Inside the envelope was $50,000 in crisp bills. It wasn't charity, it wasn't business, it was a test for the young man sitting nervously in the driver's seat. His newly hired chauffeur, Daniel. Daniel was 24, with sharp eyes that carried both hunger and humility. He came from a struggling family on the outskirts of the city. His mother worked as a cleaner, his younger sister was still in school, and Daniel had been juggling 3 jobs before this opportunity fell into his lap. To him, working as Richard Hale's driver wasn't just a paycheck. It was a lifeline. It meant stability, dignity, and maybe even a chance to finally ease the burdens his family had carried for years. Richard studied him quietly as the car moved through the rain-soaked street. He had seen men change when money crossed their path. Friends who turned into strangers, employees who betrayed him for a handful of bills, even relatives who had sold out his trust. So tonight, the envelope sat waiting like a silent question. Who was Daniel really? They reached the grand estate on the hill. Richard gave Daniel a calm nod and stepped out into the drizzle, leaving his umbrella behind. "I'll be just a few minutes inside," he said casually, his voice carrying a deliberate nonchalance. He didn't mention the envelope. He didn't need to. As Richard disappeared inside, Daniel sat alone in the car. The storm had quieted into a steady drizzle, the scent of rain filling the night air. He shifted slightly in his seat, and that's when he noticed it. The brown envelope peeking out from the shadows of the back seat. His chest tightened. Curiosity battled with conscience as his hand hovered for a second too long. Finally, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. His fingers trembled as he opened the flap just enough to see the stack of bills inside. For a moment, his world stopped. $50,000. More money than he had ever seen in his entire life. Money that could clear his mother's medical debts. Money that could send his sister to college. Money that could lift his entire family out of the suffocating cycle they had been trapped in. But then another thought hit him, colder and sharper. This wasn't his. His heart pounded. He pressed the envelope back shut and placed it exactly where it had been. Then he leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel as if to steady himself. Tears welled in his eyes, not from temptation, but from the aching reminder of how close desperation could push someone to losing themselves. A few minutes later, Richard returned. He slid into the back seat and glanced around, his sharp eyes catching the untouched envelope resting where he had left it. He didn't say a word, just gave a faint smile that disappeared as quickly as it came. The car ride home was silent, though Richard's mind wasn't. He had expected hesitation, maybe even dishonesty. But what he saw in Daniel's eyes as he handed him the keys later that night wasn't greed. It was something deeper, something purer. The next morning, Richard called Daniel into his study. The room was filled with heavy books, paintings, and the faint aroma of cedar wood. Daniel stood nervously at the door, unsure of what he had done wrong. "Sit down," Richard said. Daniel obeyed, clutching his cap in his hands. Richard reached into his drawer and pulled out the same brown envelope. He placed it on the desk between them. Daniel's stomach dropped. "You saw this last night, didn't you?" Richard asked, his voice calm but probing. Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, sir, I did. And yet it's still here," Richard said, tapping the envelope gently. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Because, sir, it wasn't mine. No matter how much I needed it, it didn't belong to me. My mother always says, If you take what isn't yours, you lose what truly is. Richard leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Richard slid the envelope across the desk toward Daniel. "Take it," he said softly. Daniel's eyes widened. He shook his head, panic flickering across his face. "Sir, I can't. Please, I didn't mean you passed my test." Richard interrupted firmly, his voice carrying both gravity and warmth. "This money is yours, not because you took it, but because you chose not to." Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he stared at the envelope. His hands shook when he finally picked it up, not out of greed, but out of disbelief. Richard's gaze softened. The world has enough men who will sell their integrity for a quick reward. I've seen them, I've trusted them, and I've been betrayed. But you reminded me of something I thought I had lost faith in honesty. Daniel's tears spilled freely now, his voice trembling. "Sir, you don't know what this means for my family." Richard stood and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I think I do." That night, as Daniel walked home under the same rain-soaked sky, the envelope clutched close to his chest. Something inside him shifted. Not just because of the money, but because of what it represented. Trust, faith, the belief that in a world full of temptation, kindness and integrity still mattered. And for Richard, watching from the window of his study, there was a different shift. A spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the fortune he had spent his life building could finally be used to nurture something greater than wealth. Something that money alone could never buy.